Hey everybody, welcome to another episode. I'm straying from the norm here. I'm gonna get into some local politics because it's something near and dear to my heart, and this is something that kind of, I guess you could say, sparked my ire, or just a little. It was a little angering. So a little background. This is local politics to Colorado and specifically Jefferson County, county where I reside, where I grew up, all that, and it is relating to an incident that occurred last year on September 10th, the same day as Charlie Kirk's horrible, tragic assassination. There was also a school shooting in Evergreen, Colorado, at my former high school, where I have ties to the community. I have family that lives there. I grew up there. I graduated from the high school. So, needless to say, I'm connected to this, and I have an interest in it. I have a dog in this fight. So, to give some background, on September 10th, 2025, an individual whose name I will not say went to the school. Uh, it was right around like lunchtime. Had a 38 special revolver, which anybody who knows anything about guns, I do. I'm former law enforcement and I've been a firearms instructor for over a decade. So a 38 special revolver, especially a Smith and Wesson, is a six-shot revolver that fires 38 caliber ammunition, which is like a little bit smaller than a 9 millimeter, or roughly about the same size. They're very minuscule difference. And so he went to school and he fired about 20 rounds, which means he reloaded a couple times. Two individual students were severely injured, with life-threatening injuries. I mean, it was very, very close that they could have died. From all reporting I've seen, it took the sheriff's office, because Jefferson County, Evergreen's an unincorporated town within Jefferson County, so the sheriff's office has jurisdiction over that area as the law enforcement entity. In full disclosure, I've never been employed by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. So the Sheriff's Office, from what I've heard, it took about 3 minutes to respond, which is a pretty damn good response time, especially to an active shooter with shots fired and injuries. They responded, and apparently at that time, that's when this individual ceased shooting, or something happened, and he took his own life. That was the only fatality of the day, was the perpetrator of this terrible act. Those are the facts on the ground. Now, on top of that, the SRO, the school resource officer, who is a sheriff's deputy that is assigned to the school, apparently, this is from information provided by the sheriff's office to the public. The individual deputy that was assigned to the high school was not present that day because they were out with either illness or injury. I believe they released FMLA. It could have been that they were on a leave of absence for some sort of medical or otherwise related reason. And so the SRO assigned to Conifer High School, which is the next high school down the road in the mountain area. There are two mountain area schools, Evergreen and Conifer, in western part of Jefferson County. The SRO from Conifer was pulling double duty and basically having to bounce back between both schools. A little bit of a problem there. We'll get into that later. So apparently the SRO was responding to a car accident that potentially had injuries. Now, that's perfectly normal for if there's nobody else available, and or they're the nearest deputy available and there's injuries in the accident, then a police officer, you want somebody with training to respond. First responder, you want them to respond. Now, they weren't going to investigate the accident because most counties in Colorado have a deal where Colorado State Patrol conducts the motor vehicle accident investigation. So deputies just arrive on scene to provide immediate medical care, assess the situation, and report what implements are needed. So it's some fault. That one's tough. I really can't blame the SRO in this instance for not being there when the shooting occurred. And There is some conjecture that the individual that conducted this act may have waited until the SRO departed to do this. Now, were they expecting them? I don't know. I don't know the intelligence gathering that may or may not have been conducted by this individual. We're talking about a teenager here, so I they could be really smart and have figured out that, okay, at lunchtime the SRO takes a lunch break, or around noon the SRO goes and checks on the other high school, what have you. We don't know that. That's never been made available to the public, possibly never will be known. However, it did happen, and I mean, my thoughts and prayers are with my community, my hometown. I lived there the majority of my life, and so I do have deep connections to the community, and I hurt with the community after this incident. Now, a lot of the controversy arising from this has been really just a lack of information sharing from the sheriff's office. There has not been a whole lot of transparency. There's not been a whole lot of release of information to the public. And they've used that tired excuse, we don't want to compromise the investigation. I understand that. Having been there, done that, worn the t-shirt, and did the job, I understand. The more information you release to the public, the more it compromises your investigation, because you could get, people coming in and just give put you on the wrong path, or information, that the public provides just kind of gets you spun up in the wrong direction. I understand that. However, a lot of it unrelated. I mean, the perpetrator is deceased, so you're not looking for a court case in prosecuting the actual act itself. But then on top of that, you also have to factor in Colorado, they passed a law in 2021, HB 21-1106, safe storage of firearms, which was then codified later that year in 2021. I believe it was July 1st. Usually laws go into effect the July after they're passed, sometimes. And that was codified into Colorado Revised Statutes 18-12-114, and that is the secure firearm storage required. And what the law says, and I'll show you here. So first, there's the bill, which is here, and it says, concerning measures to secure firearms to prevent use by persons not lawfully permitted to possess firearms. And it basically says it's to prevent access by unsupervised juveniles, which is what the perpetrator of this act was. They were an unsupervised juvenile. And the law clearly states that firearms must be responsibly and securely stored when they're not in use to prevent access by unsupervised juveniles and other unauthorized users. A person responsibly and securely stores a firearm when the person carries the firearm on his or her person or within such close proximity thereto that the person can readily retrieve and use the firearm as if the person carried the firearm on his or her person. So that's the carry kind of requirement. Or the firearm is kept in a locked gun safe or other secure container in a manner that a reasonable person would believe to be secure, and a juvenile or resident of the premises who is ineligible to possess a firearm does not have access to the key, combination, or other unlocking mechanism necessary to open the safe or container. Or the person properly installs a locking device on the firearm, and a juvenile resident of the premises who is ineligible to possess a firearm does not have access to the key, combination, or unlocking mechanism necessary to remove the locking device. That's a trigger lock. Or the firearm is personalized firearm and the safety characteristics of the firearm are activated. And then they go, they commit the act of unlawful storage of firearm when the person fails to responsibly or securely store a firearm, as described in this top part here, upon any premises that person owns or controls, and the person knows or reasonably should know that a juvenile can gain access to the firearm without permission of the parents the juvenile's parent or guardian, or the resident. That's to, yeah, people who can't have guns, like felons and the crazy people. Unlawful storage of a firearm is a class 2 misdemeanor. Keep that in mind. We will get to that in a bit. So, and then of course there's the other part that doesn't apply to antiques and curios, but yeah, that's another story for another time. So basically the law says you have to secure your firearm in a locking container and or with a trigger guard lock, a trigger lock, or something that prevents the action from being manipulated. This is like a cable lock. These are the ATF kind of mandated that all guns have to be sold with this locking device years ago. So yeah, immaterial to our purposes. But anyway, so that's the law. Now the whole thing, the whole investigation, there's been some hoopla going around. The community, and I've seen comments and stuff. The community and the high school community have both been pretty dissatisfied, I guess would be the best word to use, on the handling of this investigation. There's not been a whole lot of transparency. They have not made a lot of public statements. They've made a few, and they've been kind of whatever. But it really has been very little information has come out from the sheriff's office. And I understand their excuse to compromise the investigation. So maybe they were investigating if charging the parents of this individual with that crime was appropriate, and that I don't know how that would compromise the investigation by releasing information. But either way, so a lot of people have been asking a lot of questions. They're saying now, this is the most recent news from yesterday, February 4th, the sheriff's office released a press release saying that their investigation is complete. And there are a lot of pending questions the community wants to have answered that were not answered. And then new questions and new concerns arise from it. And so let's go through their press release and what they said. So parents of shooter not facing charges. The investigation into the shooting at Evergreen High School has concluded, and the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office remains committed to transparency regarding its findings. Full disclosure, being former law enforcement, I find no fault with the response. There were some issues with the medical side of things and whatnot. I won't get into. That's just some inside information I had, in the immediate aftermath. But I fault the first responders did a great job. Kudos to the sheriff's office. I have a good friend who responded. So kudos to them. They are heroes. They did a great job that day. I am not criticizing them. I am not going after them. Kudos to the Evergreen Fire Department. The Evergreen Fire Department is in a transitional phase, going from a volunteer to they're kind of trying to push for a paid department. But at the time, it was a volunteer fire department with full-time paramedics on the ambulance crews. So they're paid paramedics. They're responding, but the firefighters that responded predominantly are volunteers. So kudos to them. They did a great job. The response to this, I think, saved the lives of the two individuals, the two victims that were hurt. And I think they did a good service to the community. From everything I heard, the lockdown procedures went very well for the high school. So kudos to the high school staff. I am not in no way criticizing the high school staff. They did nothing wrong here. So in terms of the sheriff's office, the deputies that responded and the first responders that responded and the school staff and employees all did a great job that day. This could have been way worse. 20 rounds were fired, and if the only fatality was the shooter, I would say that that's the best possible scenario if you had to have such a bad, tragic scenario happen. So God was looking out. Now, This is where some conjecture online came in, and I've been present for some of these conversations in the last, call it 15 to 18 hours. Investigators, this is a key point. Investigators were unable to speak with the shooter's parents, which complicated efforts to determine how the shooter gained access to the firearm and to confirm its ownership history. This was one of the primary challenges encountered during the investigation. This is where I need to step in and tell, especially to the people who are upset about this, like, how dare they not cooperate? There's a little thing called the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says you can't be compelled to provide testimony that basically can condemn you. It's, you know, incriminating. It's basically the right to not self-incriminate. The parents likely, because we'll read later, lawyered up, basically. And they have that right, and I'm not faulting them for that, because, as I have said, being former law enforcement, I still say this all the time, don't talk to the cops. If you're involved in something, don't talk to the cops. That nothing you say is going to help you. So, they didn't talk to the cops. They followed good advice. They lawyered up. They said, we want to speak to an attorney, because there's a potential they could be charged with a crime. Like I said, 1812-114. So, I won't fault them for that. However, this is where things get kind of weird. An incredible team, so here's their findings. An incredible team of law enforcement professionals from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, and the ATF, Denver Field Division, and the FBI were relentless in their pursuit of evidence and information related to this case. Now, you may be asking, why is the ATF involved? Good question. Let me help you out here. The ATF does have a unique position where they can conduct what's called a firearms trace. This is where they basically trace the ownership or the history of a firearm. And I can't remember exactly what year, but it was passed into law that all new firearms from here on out, and this was decades ago. I can't remember the exact year. I think it was like 1962 or something. Correct me if I'm wrong. Forgive me if I'm inaccurate on my exact date. But they passed a law where all firearms have to have a serial number. All manufacturers record the serial number and basically have a paper trail of what distributor that firearm goes to. For those that don't know how the firearms industry works, most of the time, the vast majority of guns that are manufactured by a professional manufacturer, like Glock, Smith & Wesson, Sig Sauer, Remington, Mossberg, etc., they manufacture the firearm, and then usually those firearms will get sold to a distributor. One of the biggest ones is Davidson's. They're a huge firearms distributor. Those distributors will then be the point of sale for licensed firearms dealers, or FFLs, to obtain firearms to sell to the public. So your local gun shop, your Bass Pro Shops or Cabela's, or not Dick's anymore, but all these gun stores, all these places that sell firearms legally and lawfully with a federal license, all obtain their firearms through a distributor who obtains their firearms direct from the manufacturer. So there is a paper trail. I mean, everybody tracks this because this is what the law states. It has to be tracked. It's law and regulation. So the gun leaves the distributor, goes to a gun store. When the gun is sold to an individual, the individual fills out what's called a 4473, which is a transfer of a firearm form required by the ATF, required by federal law, to be completed. That records the serial number. That records who purchased that serial numbered firearm. And that gets filed. And per law, the dealer has to retain those records. And when they no longer are in business, those records are turned over to the ATF. And I've heard conjecture that the ATF has rooms full of these files. So that's part of the ATF's job, is to trace firearms that are used in the commission of crimes or reported stolen and recovered, whatever. So what the ATF does is they find out who purchased the firearm, and that's what happened here. The weapon used in the assault and attempted murder of multiple victims, including two who sustained life-threatening injuries, was identified as a Smith & Wesson .38 Special revolver. Investigators were able to trace the firearm to its original purchaser, who bought the weapon in Florida in 1966. The ownership trail ended there, as the original owner is deceased. Investigators tracked down and interviewed his surviving family members in an effort to determine any subsequent ownership. Those efforts, however, were unsuccessful. This is where I kind of have to call into question how much due diligence did these investigators really do? Because the end state is that it somehow wound up in Evergreen, Colorado. It left the distribution network in Florida in 1966. You have a record. The ATF discovered what store sold it. They probably have an idea of who the distributor at the time was, if they even dealt with distributors in the 60s. I don't know. The kind of rundown I gave is relevant to the current way things work. In the 60s, it might have been a different process. But either way, they were able to trace the firearm back to this one owner in Florida, and then were unable to make a connection between him and where it is now. So then they go one further. This is another part that seems kind of hinky with what we discover later. A DNA profile was identified on the firearm, so they swabbed the gun for DNA. This is common in crimes. And investigators obtained a court order to collect DNA samples from the shooter's parents. Normal investigative procedure here. DNA analysis excluded both parents as contributors to the DNA profile, resulting in no evidentiary link between the parents and the weapon. So basically, the parents' DNA was not on the gun. Now, okay. So basically, the shooter is the only person who possessed the firearm recently. Could have been wiped down, cleaned, whatever, before he used it. Okay. That's okay. Then, new information emerged on January 23rd, 2026, when the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office lead investigator received notification from the parent's attorney acknowledging that the firearm was owned by a maternal grandparent. So, maternal grandparent might be a connection to the dude in Florida. The handgun was described as a family heirloom that was rarely seen or used and stored, this is the important part, stored out of sight near the back of a large, locked gun safe. According to the letter, the shooter did not have access to the safe, except for brief moments when it was opened by his father. And then this is where some questions come into play. So now the investigators have the endpoint link. They know it was purchased from this individual in Florida in 1966, and now they know it ended up with this family. This is where my military intelligence background comes into play when I did targeting operations, where you do a Venn diagram, or not a Venn diagram, a dot matrix kind of diagram, where you connect dots between people. So how is this family and or the maternal grandparent connected to the person in Florida? That's where you could draw that connection. Is this the wife? Was the deceased person in Florida the grandfather? This is important. This is relevant because it establishes a chain of custody of the firearm. And then it ends up in this family's home, and it's a family heirloom. But this is where the wording gets weird. Stored out of sight near the back of a large locked gun safe. So that leaves me to question, was it stored in the gun safe, or was it stored near behind the gun safe? That's an important and relevant detail here. And they're saying he didn't have access except for brief moments when it was opened by his father. Which begs the question, is there a possibility that he saw the combination to the safe when his father opened it and memorized it, and then now he has access to the safe. And so these are questions that are not answered. So then we get to review of potential charges. Throughout the investigation, investigators provided ongoing updates to the First Judicial District Attorney's Office as all potential charges related to the parents of the shooter were considered. The investigation ultimately focused on CRS 1812-114, the law we discussed, secure firearm storage required, and CRS 1812-108.7, providing a firearm to a juvenile. I believe that one is also a misdemeanor. So these are both misdemeanors. We'll discuss that in a moment. Ultimately, investigators determined this. There was insufficient evidence to establish probable cause or meet the legal requirements required to present the case to the district attorney for charges. The case will be closed, pending the emergence of new evidence that would warrant the filing of charges. So they're basically saying we don't have enough to charge these parents. We've determined we're not going to hand the case over to the DA. So it was a decision made at the sheriff's office level to not pursue charges against the parents. However, reading this law is pretty cut and dry. Unsupervised juveniles should not have access to a firearm. Now, being a Second Amendment, I guess you could say absolutist, and getting on my soapbox here, I view most gun laws, almost all, as infringements on our Second Amendment rights. However, I'm mixed on this law because I feel like as a former deputy sheriff and as a firearms instructor and as a parent and a responsible gun owner, all of those combined, what I fear more than my child dying in a mass shooting, which, rationally speaking, the probability is very low. It is very unlikely that your child will ever be harmed in a mass shooting, especially at school. It's just the probability is really low. It's almost a non-issue. You have a better chance of your child drowning. I'm more worried about my kid in a pool than I am my kid at school getting killed. What scares me even more is my kid getting their hands on a gun in my home without my knowledge or permission and hurting themselves or others. That scares me. That prompts me to take action to prevent that, which is very simple. My guns are secured in safes. My guns are locked in those safes when not being carried or going to the range. Therefore, my child does not have access to those safes and locking those containers, those locked storage devices. I followed the law before the law was a law. And my daughter does not have access to these safes. She doesn't know the combination, and she lacks the biometrics to access. So, do what responsible gun owners do. Make sure that barrier there is there. This didn't happen in this case. Clearly, as evidenced by the result. And that's why I, along with a lot of members of the community, are very upset by this really unfortunate turn of events in this horrible tragedy. And this is why I feel the need to speak out on it, because this is a miscarriage of justice. This is the perfect example of this law where it applies. Because this is exactly what this law was passed to hopefully prevent, and it didn't. And so when you violate the law, there needs to be accountability and consequences. And I feel for these parents. Their son is dead, and that is a tragedy. However, it was an avoidable tragedy. And therefore, it's kind of like a preventable tragedy is more tragic, almost. And so it's one of those things that really, really, really kind of irks me that there's no accountability on the behalf of the sheriff's office. And that's what really kind of gets a lot of people upset. So this is where, like, we're calling for accountability and we're calling for justice, and the sheriff's office is like, no. Even though this is the perfect case, this is a clear-cut case of where this law is applicable, because this law, really, this is the worst case scenario for violators of this law. You don't secure your firearm properly, or you don't prevent access for a juvenile to getting to your firearms, and they get the gun and they go shoot a school up. And that's exactly what happened here, and that's exactly why this law should have been, the charges should have been filed. Now, I've been accused of victim shaming, even though these parents are not the victims. The two kids that were fighting for their lives in the hospital are the victims. These parents are involved and responsible parties in this. It was a firearm from their home that they possessed that they failed to secure. Period. End of story. That's the facts. And the fact that the sheriff, and they even admitted it, their little, their notification to the investigator from their attorney acknowledged that they owned the firearm, that it was stored in their home. And the wishy-washy language, stored out of sight near the back of a large log gun safe. Near the back or in the gun safe? That is a key detail. And that is where, as the detective should be asking this question for clarity. We need to know for clarity, was it stored in the safe or not? Period. If it wasn't stored in the safe, absolutely charge them. If it was stored in the safe, how did the kid get access? That's questions that need to be asked. And that is why the law is applicable here. And, people are like, well, the parents have been through enough. Well, tough. I'm sorry, but he could have killed 20 people. This could have been worse than Columbine. And there needs to be accountability. And worst of all, it's a class 2 misdemeanor, which in Colorado there are levels, there are classes of, you have a class 1 felony, which is the worst of the worst. That's, first degree murder, crimes like that. You have class 2 felony, class 3 felony, and then you have drug felonies, but they're lesser. So felonies are punishable by prison, typically. Those are the serious crimes. Misdemeanors are punishable by a potential punishment is jail. It's not always the case. So you have class 1, which is the most serious, class 2, class 3, then petty offense. Petty offense is not punishable by jail. You can't impose a jail sentence over a petty offense unless they fail to appear. Then they can be put in jail. I digress. That's immaterial. So a class 2 misdemeanor typically is punishable by about 120 days in jail, 6 months, and or a fine of up to $750. So $750 fine and 6 months in jail. That's the maximum penalty right there. So you're looking at like not the worst of the worst here. And first time offenders, if the parents have a clean criminal history, odds are, and I saw this a lot working in law enforcement and working in the courts, misdemeanors typically, first time offenders don't result in a jail sentence at all. You get like probation. And in this case, class 2 misdemeanor, they might get deferred, where you keep your nose clean for a period of like 1 to 3 years. Usually it's like a year. Keep your nose clean for a year and everything goes away. They do a deferred sentence. And that's a potential. So it's not like they're going to get the most serious. They're not going to prison for murder. Now, on top of that, there is also, they could be civilly liable, which if I were the parents of either kid that was hurt, I would absolutely be suing these people for negligence, because at some point something broke down and the kid got access to the gun. And that is why that is why a lot of us are demanding accountability here. That's why this decision by the sheriff's office is so infuriating, because it's like, this is the prime case for this law to be applied. and they're not even doing it. And it just goes to show. That's why I do not fault the sheriff's office employees, the deputies that work there. I do fault the investigators at some point, because absent more information, this does look like the investigators, the detectives, the supervising detective dropped the ball here. And from what it appears, they did a pretty shoddy investigation once they figured out the causal link between the gun and the original purchaser. But who cares? At any rate, this was a poor decision by the detective branch at the sheriff's office. And from my perspective, I fault them and the sheriff, the leadership within the sheriff's office, which I've not been a fan of. They have done, I think, a terrible public relations job on this entire case. And I don't agree with a lot of the decisions the sheriff made. I don't agree with the sheriff. She is an anti-gun Democrat. And I really, this would be a perfect case for somebody like that. She was endorsed by every town, and Moms Demand Action are fans of this sheriff. And this would be the perfect case to prove your worth to them, and just nope. How about no? Which really just kind of is disappointing. I am supremely disappointed in the sheriff's office on this case. And I think this is a gross miscarriage of justice. This is a perfect opportunity to send a message to the community that you're taking this seriously. That gun ownership does come... I am a 2A advocate through and through. And this is actually a law I kind of agree with. Because as a responsible gun owner, I make sure those barriers are in place. I do not get complacent on that. I make sure the barriers are in place so that my child has restricted access to my firearms. 100%. No one touches my firearms without mine or my wife's permission in our household. That is what responsible gun owners should and must do. That is part of being responsible. And the fact that we're just... Now, this is the message the sheriff's office is sending. That, okay, well, so a straw purchase, you can't prosecute a straw purchase because, we're not going to enforce the laws. Somebody's buying a gun for somebody else. You can't enforce it because here you don't enforce it where it actually counts and it actually is applicable. So, bottom line, my message here is shame on Reggie Marinelli and the supervising staff at the sheriff's office. And I don't want to fault the first judicial district attorney's office, but I mean, they weren't presented a case, even though they were in ongoing communication, and the DA's office just didn't. That is the state of affairs we're in Colorado, where we've got more of this soft on crime BS, and I'm not happy, and I demand better from our elected representatives, our elected sheriff, our elected district attorney, and their supervising staff. Again, no fault rests with the responding deputies to this case. They did a good job. It's your detective and your lead investigator and your sheriff that dropped it and that soiled your reputation. Period. End of day. And I'll get off my soapbox now. I appreciate you sticking out with me for this kind of long video, but I wanted to get my thoughts out there because this is something near and dear to my heart, and I feel like if we don't enforce the laws, we run into chaos. I know it's weird to hear a libertarian say that, but some laws are necessary, and I kind of like having a civilization. I kind of like having a society where we kind of have some modicum of order and that there's consequences to bad actions. And that's something that everybody should support. Whether you agree with all laws or not, there are some good laws out there. And I think this is one of those instances where a law with its heart in the right place was not allowed to be applied. And that's just shameful. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.